Good morning, everyone. It gives me an immense pleasure to welcome you all to day 4, session 7 of AICTE Atal Faculty Development Program on Industry Academia Synergy in Disaster Management and Resilient Infrastructure for Advancing Sustainable Development. So today it is again my honor to formally introduce our today's esteemed resource person for session 7 of this AICTE Atal Faculty Development Program, Dr. Sudarshan Bobde. Dr. Bobde is currently serving as the Dean Research and Development and Associate Professor in the Department of Civil Engineering at PCET's Pimpri Chinchwad College of Engineering and Research, Ravet, Pune. He has been awarded a doctorate in civil engineering by Savitribai Phule Pune University, Pune, with his doctoral research focusing on disaster management through geospatial techniques, conducted in association with ISRO's Indian Institute of Remote Sensing IIRS Dehradun. Dr. Bobde brings with him over 13 years of distinguished experience in academics, research, and academic administration. His professional expertise includes resilient and sustainable infrastructure systems, planning of urban and rural settlements, climate change adaptation, disaster risk reduction, geotechnical engineering, transportation engineering, and applications of remote sensing and GIS. He has published several research articles in reputed Scopus and Web of Science indexed international journals and has contributed scholarly books chapters with internationally recognized publishers such as Springer. Dr. Bobde has made significant contributions to innovation and applied research with multiple granted patents and registered copyrights to his credits. He has successfully executed government funded and industry sponsored research projects, particularly in the domains of climate resilient infrastructure and disaster risk mitigation. He is a life member of eminent professional bodies, including the Indian Society of Technical Education, Indian Road Congress, Indian Geotechnical Society, and Indian Society of Remote Sensing. Dr. Bobde has served as a resource person and expert speaker in numerous AICTE Atal faculty development programs, STTPs, and national level training initiatives. His academic and professional contributions strongly align with national priorities on climate resilient development and sustainable infrastructure planning. The theme of session, Planning Resilient Urban and Rural Settlements, Integrating Climate and Disaster Risk Consideration, is highly relevant and closely aligned with his research focus and professional expertise. We are confident that his deliberations will provide valuable insights into integrated planning frameworks, policy perspectives, and practical implementation strategies for the resilient settlement development. Now, I respectfully hand over this session to Dr. Sudarshan Bobde and request him to kindly commence his expert deliberation. One of the speaker who has got excellent feedback for the session 1. So I request you, sir, to please continue.
Thank you. Thank you so much for such a wonderful introduction, ma'am. Kindly confirm my screen is properly shared with everyone.
Yes, sir. Yes.
Am I audible? Yes.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Thank you so much. Respected dignitaries, esteemed resource persons, dear faculty colleagues, professionals and participants, good morning one and all. It is indeed a privilege to welcome you to this Atal FDP Atal Faculty Development Program on Industry Academia Synergy in Disaster Management and Resilient Infrastructure for Advancing Sustainable Development. I sincerely thank the AICTE Training and Learning Academy and GK Guzar Memorial Charitable Trust, Dr. Ashok Guzar Technical Institutes, Dr. Davlatrao Ahir College of Engineering and Engineering Karad for providing this important platform to deliberate on one of the most pressing challenges of our times. Friends, the topic we are discussing today, that is planning resilient urban and rural settlements, integrating climate and disaster risk consideration, is no longer a futuristic or optional theme. It is a present day professional responsibility. And so, to understand this particular responsibility, today we'll discuss this topic in detail. So, for that, we need a good mindset, and that shifting mindset, that is nothing but adoption ready, or what we can say, the change adoption ready mindset is much important. So we often say that the disaster are natural, but in reality, their impacts are largely man-made. The climate change is intensifying the hazard, but it is poor planning, unregulated development, and neglect of the risk-informed design that converts the hazards into disaster. As we have already discussed this in the session one, so as engineers, planners, architects, administrators, or academicians, this places a moral and professional obligation upon us, and that we need to understand as a professional responsibility. So India today is witnessing the rapid urbanization, infrastructure expansion, and the economic growth. But much of this growth is happening in a high risk landscapes. And so, whenever we are talking about these settlements and the increased risk, there are the, what we can say, the decisions, there is a planning where we are failing. And that is the reason when we are talking about this, these high-risk landscapes are nothing but the seismic zones, the floodplains, landslide-prone hill regions, coastal belts, and the climate-sensitive rural areas. By 2020-50, as I have already discussed in session one, that nearly 70% of the India's population will live in the urban areas. And the question before us is not how fast we build, but how wisely we plan and build. And that is why the codal provisions, the various frameworks needs to be discussed today in detail. Now, this brings us to crucial mindset shift, and that we need to understand. Whenever we are talking generally, or we can say that traditionally, the planning has been reactive. We designed for averages, responded after the disaster, and treated resilience as an add-on. But today, every planning approval, every infrastructural project, and every land use decision, in fact, a disaster risk reduction. And that is what we need to understand in detail. So, resilient planning demands that we move from post-disaster response to pre-disaster prevention. So, when we are talking about the traditional versus resilient planning, this particular conventional planning versus resilient planning, we have discussed a little bit in earlier, can say reactive before anything is about to happen. So when we are talking about this, yes, today we will discuss the national and international frameworks, then key acts, policies, and institutional mechanism related to the disaster risk reduction and climate adoption. And at the same time, we will discuss some case studies, the 2025 research articles, the case studies, relevant IS codes, guidelines, and the codal provisions we are need to be discussed thoroughly. And very importantly, Indian and regional case studies we would like to discuss in detail. So we will examine how climate risk influence the settlement planning, why resilience is a planning philosophy rather than a checklist, and how engineers, architects, urban planners, geotechnical experts, and the policymakers must work together in an integrated manner. So I strongly believe that the resilient settlements are not built after the first brick is laid. They are built on the drawing board, in planning approvals, in policy decisions, and in the minds of the professional like all of us you present here. Let's today discuss, let's, what we can say, this plan to have the discussion which will help reflect, question conventional practices, and reorient our teaching, research consultancy, and the field implementation towards the risk sensitive, climate responsive, and the people centric development. With this thought, I once again welcome you all and look forward to a highly engaging, insightful, and the impactful session. Thank you. Now we will begin with the session. Now, as I have already told you that we need to learn some frameworks. So, HIGO is nothing but one of the framework, and this was introduced in 2005. So, the foundation for resilient settlement. Try to understand this framework when first introduced at global level. At that particular time, it was accepted by various nations as a foundation for resilient settlement. We all are aware that the disaster losses are increasing due to unplanned urbanization, development in high risk zones, environmental degradation, and the climate variability and change. Though these particular four parameters we all are aware, but this particular philosophy, when we are dealing at an actual construction, when we are just planning or constructing, executing the infrastructure, we are very simply neglecting the resilient infrastructure. And that is the reason this particular framework was the first global framework to link the disaster with the development and planning. So we can say, in nutshell, this framework is suggesting that the resilience begins before construction, and it is very well said through this particular framework studies that it begins not only before construction but at the planning stage itself. So we will discuss the important parameters from this particular framework. Now see, in this particular framework, which was suggested for the tenure from 2005 to 2015, the simple goal with which this framework was introduced at global level is substantial reduction of disaster losses. Now, how we could able to reduce the disaster losses? For that, first of all, we need to understand what will be the probable disaster losses, what will be the intensity, what will be the magnitude, what sort of the risk associated, what we have learned from the earlier case studies of the failures, which type of risk may arise in the future. So, substantially, we are focusing mainly through this particular framework in terms of the reduction of the disaster losses. The focus was totally towards the nation building, towards the various communities, towards formal and informal communities, we can say, those who are living at a landscape, those who are at very much dangerous situation. And so the focus was totally towards the nation as a whole, because whenever there is a loss in terms of the infrastructure, it is a nation wide loss, and it is directly or indirectly causing troublesome to the communities. At the same time, the communities, those who are not involved into the actual flow of the society, they are suffering a lot because they are not at all aware about the disaster, and after disaster how to recover from it, before disaster how to be prepared for same. And that's why this framework helped a lot to understand the key features that we civil engineers, architects, and any interdisciplinary engineering fraternities needs to be understand well in advance. So the scope of this particular framework was related to the natural hazard especially, and the environmental and technological risk. Now try to understand, whenever there is a man-made disasters, yes, we can have some rules, regulation, acts for that. But when we are talking about the natural hazards, yes, we can able to predict, yes, we can have some, what we can say, the little control on it, but we are unable to stop it 100%. And that is the reason the scope of this framework was related to the natural hazard. The secondly, the scope was also covering the environmental and technological risk. Yes, the environmental risk, it is related to the climate change. The technological risk, it is related to the advanced technology, the materials, the carbon footprints, and allied subjects in detail. Now, the strong emphasis was given in this particular framework is on the land use. the infrastructure and institutional capacity. Now, land use, though in town planning, in ATP office, though they are defining, they are just what we can say, the sharing the resolutions, the government resolution related to the boundaries and the areas needs to be developed for different categories at different location with different capacities. But still, we, the human being, due to the greed towards the progress, we are not at all respecting that land use, and that land masses are developed like anything, and this disastrous development will just what we can say invite the natural disasters in future. And so the land use is one of the very important parameter suggested by the this particular framework. The infrastructure is, we are thinking for the infrastructure those who are capable to cope up against the disaster. But when we are talking about the recovery, rebuild, retrofitting, or the reconstruction of that particular yes infrastructure afterwards, we are not in position to understand the infrastructure constructed or existing infrastructure in true sense. And that is what very much important framework. Institutional capacity, yes, we all are aware that starting from the school and up to the higher education level, there should be the proper awareness campaign regarding the disaster and the risk associated with it, so that everyone could able to understand the impact and accordingly everyone would like to help to reduce the risk at a greater extent. That is what the institutional urban and rural settlement planning was observed from this particular framework. We will discuss the yes actual points that are very much beneficial for the engineers created in settlement. Try to understand, there is a very simple fact on this particular exposure allow us to understand the impact on various resources. I have already told you the 5 M's and the time as a very important precious resource. So the hazard, vulnerability, and exposure, this particular three phenomena needs to be well understood way before we are is about to execute the infrastructural activity. Now, how to understand the hazard? So hazard is nothing but hazard mapping will be happened by using the RS and GIS. There are so many tools, there are so many methods, and nowadays with the AI ML algorithm, it is very easy to prepare the hazard zonation map related to the any hazard. Hazard may be flood, hazard may be earthquake, hazard may be landslide, hazard may be cyclone, heat waves, anything. So hazards that we need to first of all understand which type of hazard or which type of, we can say the compound hazard may be there, so that particular thing we need to take into account. Now vulnerability, now try to understand vulnerability. This particular phenomena is having the very what we can say the great depth, and that we need to understand. Vulnerability means what? In association with the hazard, what are the fragile areas, what are the fragile what we can say the system, they will get disrupted and they are not in position to recover afterwards. So the vulnerability assessment needs to be studied well in advance. In terms of the landslide, the slopes. In terms of the landslide, it is drainage. In terms of the landslide, it is vegetation cover. In terms of the landslide, it is the population residing on the slope. So likewise, we need to understand the vulnerability. Now, exposure, as I have already told you, it is related to how we are about to sustain against the any disaster. That means the preparedness level is phenomena. Now altogether is about to create some typical level of the risk. Now risk will definitely increases due to the construction in floodplains and slopes, due to the informal settlements, due to the weak building practices, and due to ignoring the climate trends. Now, it is our general mindset that whenever we are talking about the climate trends, what we are doing, we are taking the average values related to the climatic what we can say, the scenarios or the incidences happen till date. When we are talking about the flood, what we are doing, we are taking the highest flood level on the basis of the last few decades average value of the flood. And that is the reason when we are supposed to prepare for the resilient infrastructure, now here we're not supposed to go for the averaging, we're supposed to respect the highest probable disaster volume, or what we can say its intensity and magnitude, that needs to be coped up by the infrastructure we are about to plan. And that is the reason these particular parameters we need to study well in advance. So try to understand, risk will definitely increases due to the exposure and vulnerability, due to the, yes, the weak building practices, that is nothing but the codal provision is there, but we are not respecting the codal provision, that we need to understand. So this framework is just highlighting in 2005. Today we are in 2025 and we are discussing this particular topic. So at global level, since 2005 they are preparing the, what we can say, the infrastructural planning accordingly. So the disaster are development failures, not the natural events. So first of all, we all need to understand and believe strongly that the planning is the major concern in resilient infrastructure. It is not related to the any disaster and understanding of it, but the planning for the infrastructural development itself will allow us to reduce the risk. Now, when we are talking about the next point, that is nothing but there are various priorities they have mentioned. Today we will discuss the priorities related to the engineering aspect. So in this particular framework, when we are talking the making disaster risk reduction a planning priority. Now, disaster risk reduction, yes, this DRR should be the planning priority. Now, try to understand till date what we are doing. We are planning or designing the infrastructure by just giving some weightage to the, what we can say, the past history or the past studies or past, what we can say, the understanding out of the failure concerns. But we never ever think for the disaster, its probability, its recurrence, its intensity, magnitude, its risk associated with that particular disaster. And so here the planning priority should be there. So the disaster risk reduction must be the national and local priority. And till date, whatever the infrastructural development is happening in India, yes, till 2020, the DRR was not at all considered. But now, since 2020, the DRR report should be accompanied alongside with the detailed project report. So always try to understand there is a great scope for the civil engineers and the architects to understand this particular concern in detail, and accordingly just provide some additional studies and its report for the proper analysis of the, yes, viability or feasibility of that particular infrastructural projects in near future. So the national and local priority should be there, institutionally embedded. Now try to understand this particular parameter. Whatever we are teaching to the students in a nowadays scenario, we are only sharing with them, or we are only giving the guidance on how to use the codal provision, how to check, what we can say, its feasibility in terms of the cross checks and all other safety parameters. But we are not emphasizing on the disaster and associated risk. What will happen if there is a landslide? What will happen to the retaining structure if there will be a landslide? What will happen if there was, what we can say, the uh, great rainfall supposed to be observed after 2 to 3 years from now onwards, once that retaining structure is in existence? So such a sort of studies are missing in a nowadays teaching, and that is what we need to taught to the student, so that this particular parameter will give us or allow us to have the, what we can say, the future ready infrastructural planning for the coming generation. Next, here integration is also required in terms of the development plans and the urban and rural planning policies. Now, this sort of integration, what sort of integration is, what we can say, suggested through this particular framework is nothing but there should be the proper development plans. Whatever we are planning, whatever we are suggesting as an infrastructural, yes, what we can say, the solution for that particular area, that particular plan should be well, what we can say, a well advanced mention in the development policies for that urban or rural plannings. And this is totally missing. Whatever we are planning nowadays, whatever we are suggesting, whatever we are executing on the ground, they are not at all in line with the policies, because policies are not at all in place for the development. And that is what the concern they have mentioned under the priority number 1. So the planning approvals must internalize the disaster risk consideration. This is what this particular framework is suggesting. Now, risk informed planning through the assessment. Now, try to understand the key actions from HIGO. They are suggesting that there should be the hazard mapping, there should be the vulnerability assessment, there should be the multi-hazard risk analysis, and the climate sensitive risk monitoring. So these particular 4 parameters should be addressed alongside with the DPR for risk informed planning. Now try to understand risk informed planning. What they are suggesting, that not only related to the structural engineering, geotechnical engineering, or civil engineering point of view, but also in line with the community as a whole, the safeguard of the community against the disaster. We have to give 4 additional parameter alongside with the detailed project report in, yes, what we can say, here onwards, along while just having the permission for that particular project. So the project appraisal is there. There are so many types of project appraisal. Technical appraisal is there, economical appraisal is there, then financial appraisal is there, then what we can say, environmental appraisal is there, social and political appraisal is there. So there are so many aspects of the any project appraisal. But alongside with this particular 4-point agenda should be addressed for that particular project. And this 4-point agenda should be titled as risk informed planning. If we all are aware about the risk to be dealt by that particular infrastructure, okay, this particular parameter will aware us about how that infrastructure will behave. We can able to plan its behavior, we can able to plan its retrofitting, repair, or recovery after the disaster accordingly. So that is what we need to understand in advance. Now the planning application, here in this particular framework, they have emphasized on zoning based on risk maps. So as in the last session we were discussed, there should be the susceptibility or vulnerability assessment for the localized area. Generally what happened at the nation level, the government, the NRSC, the ISRO, or the various central government agencies, they are preparing the various maps. But my dear friend, the whatever the parameter they have considered, whatever the weightages they have assigned, they are not related to the localized solution. They are related to the India as a whole. And that is the reason whenever we are going for risk informed planning, we have to prepare the zoning which is localized, what we can say, locally studied. And so the zoning based risk maps are required. Second, the infrastructure alignment with the hazard data. Now see, there are so many cases, there are so many accidents and incidents that happened till date. There is a futuristic probability that we could able to, yes, calculate well in advance. By understanding that, we need to first of all think that the suggested infrastructure and its alignment, whether it is falling in hazard zone or whether it is planned at very safe, what we can say, the location or the zones. And so the hazard data should be prepared accordingly. There are so many hazards, so the compound hazard data needs to be studied well in advance before suggesting any infrastructural growth. At the second time, the site selection guided by the risk assessment. So not only the risk associated with only one single hazard, but also the futuristic compound hazard that infrastructure supposed to bear with, that we need to study. And this particular parameter should be discussed, should be shared with the higher authority or the local government accordingly. And this is called as risk informed planning. So this should be the point in DPR from here onwards. Next one, the building a culture of safety in settlement. Now, culture of safety, here this particular framework is emphasizing on the knowledge sharing, the education and training, innovation in planning and design. So knowledge sharing, what does it mean? Knowledge sharing is nothing but whatever the best practices, the purpose of the Indian Road Congress is to share the best practices they are observing at different what we can say the states, and they need to share the same during the Indian Road Congress. Yes, what we can say conclaves. So knowledge sharing is very much important. So whatever the best practices we are following at the Western Ghats, they're supposed to be shared with the Himalayan region, territory, what we can say authorities, and vice versa. So education and training from the schooling, it is required. At the same time, they are giving the emphasis on the very important parameter, that is innovation in planning and design. My dear friend, any nation's GDP is totally dependent upon the innovation and its encashment in terms of the actual solution. And that's why we are lagging, though we are thinking for the three, what we can say, 5 trillion economy or 3 trillion economy sort of GDP and all other stuff. We are only discussing on the piece of paper. But when we are talking in reality, the China and America, what Japan, what they are doing at an actual, whatever they are inventing, they are just giving them the push in terms of the startup, in terms of the what we can say the actual implementation, and these particular ideas are in place for as a solution for some typical what we can say concern. Here in India, there are so many patented technologies are available, but we are not giving respect to that particular technologies, because we are thinking that such a sort of solution may create only the nuisance. They will be the only the overburden on the system, and that is the reason we are not respecting the innovation. But this particular framework is suggesting that we need to give the respect to the innovation in planning. So planning and design on the basis of the innovation, which type of innovation they are expecting. There will be the innovation in terms of the, yes, first material, then methodology, and this particular material and methodology should be reinvented, should be planned accordingly, so that there will be a less burden on the very precious resource called as money. So this particular parameter, that is machine methods and method what we can say machine methods and materials, needs to be invented according to the need of the localized area. Now the engineering translation for us of this particular building a culture of safety is nothing but disaster risk in engineering curricula. Now first of all, there should be a topic, there should be the what we can say the separate what we can say the subject should be allotted for disaster risk study. There should be, yes, the advanced surveying sort of studies should be involved or included into the curriculum, where the RHGIS and related modeling should happen. There should be the knowledge based planning decisions, and this should be studied according to the localized area. If such a sort of projects or the research is about to happen, definitely the local area will be studied thoroughly, and this will be beneficial for the authorities, those who are working with the, yes, the planning or what we can say governing the infrastructural activities. So the risk aware professionals, not the reactive responder. So first of all, we need to aware the professional about the risk associated with the different aspects. Now reducing risk through the planning and design. My dear friend, here this framework focuses on some particular areas, that is land use regulation. Though we have at India some land use regulation, but whether they are really followed, whether they are in place, whether they are really helpful while dealing with the disaster. So answer, the simple answer is no. And that is why there should be the very strict land use regulation required from our end. Secondly, the environmental management. My dear friend, there is only on a piece of paper we are giving the undertaking that if during the construction of the road I came across the cutting activity of, say suppose 50 mango trees, those who are 10 plus year old, then I will about to plant the 500, okay, the mangoes nearby in that particular vicinity. But whether we are really doing so, whether we are really taking care of the newly planted mango trees, and that is the concern related to the environmental management, and that is what the missing phenomena. So the carbon footprint that particular project is leaving behind as an impact of the successful project needs to be studied well in advance. Next, the climate adaptation integration. Now try to understand the climate adaptation integration, this is nothing but the phenomena where we are predicting about the climate and its what we can say behavior for next few decades. Now try to understand, as I have already told you, now we are not supposed to go for the averaging or the average value of any disaster or the incident happened earlier. We're supposed to think for the maximum or what we can say the highest intensity and magnitude disaster supposed to be dealt by that particular infrastructure. When we are talking about that particular high range, what we can say the parameter and its consideration during design, always try to understand there will be the direct what we can say impact on the economy or the financial aspect of that infrastructural development, and that we need to understand. So this is nothing but the climate adaptation and its integration in the design point of view. Next one, the safe housing and infrastructure. When we are talking about the rural or urban settlement, this is one of the very important parameter. If the safe housing and infrastructure projects are allowed, then the risk related to the disaster will be get lower down very greatly, and that is what we need to understand. Now settlement level action. Now try to understand, when we are talking about the land use regulation, we supposed to avoid the high risk zone for the yes what we can say residential or any sort of yes projects. The protect natural buffers, that is nothing but the wetlands are there, there are the stabilized slope vegetation covers are there, so the slope stabilization is naturally happening. So natural buffers we need to first of all protect. Climate resilient layouts, this is nothing but the integration in between the civil and the architects. So they need to think about the material, its composition, methodology, and its actual implementation on site. That will be the climate resilient. And enforce building code, as we have the code, we have the many amendments related to it, but we are not respecting it during the planning phase. That is what we need to understand through this particular framework. Now the preparedness as a planning outcome. Now try to understand through this particular framework, they have emphasized on preparedness reduces the disaster losses. They have mentioned over there that planning must enable the evacuation, emergency access, and the functional lifeline. Now try to understand this concept. Whenever we are planning for the infrastructural development, we never have ever have any report in which we have mentioned something related to the evacuation plan, we have mentioned something related to the emergency access and the functional lifeline. After completion of the project, when we are going for the what we can say the completion certificate, we have to prepare these particular documents and we have to prove these particular parameters that yes there is a sufficient evacuation, yes particular systems are in place, there is a yes ample of emergency access are provided, the functional lifelines are there, and this particular parameter at the time of the completion certificate from the architect, we are planning, we are managing somehow. But if we could able to plan these particular things well in advance while getting sanctioned from the authorities, definitely there will be a less stress on the risk handling, and this preparedness is required as per the HIGOS parameters. Now engineering focus should be there. So redundant infrastructure, we need to focus on the redundant infrastructure, we need to focus on the safe shelters, we need to think about the access roads and the services during emergency or during disasters, and the early warning integration. So here as a engineers we could able to give the solution to these particular parameters needs to be discussed during the DPR, like evacuation, emergency access, and functional lifeline, by focusing on these particular four parameters. Now next one, the HIGO principles in urban planning. So there are some challenges. When there is a challenges, when there is a question, when there is a problems, definitely there will be a solution. So in front of us, when we are talking about the urban, under urban challenges, there are some parameters like high density. We observed generally that the population is residing during or within very less area. So the high density population is one of the concern. Second, informal housing. Informal housing means what? We don't have the control on the slum areas. Okay, they are spreading, they are emerging, they are growing like anything. So the informal housing that we need to yes first of all consider. Flooding and the heat stress, that particular parameter and their impact on the society or the community directly needs to be studied. So these are the few challenges in front of us when we are talking about the urban settlement. Now, as per this particular framework, they have suggested some solution. If you are supposed to follow this particular suggested benchmark, definitely there will be a less stress on the disaster and its risk handling. So the risk based zoning should be done. Whenever there is a high risk, there should not be any property or any lives supposed to be what we can say trapped during the disastrous situation. What does it mean? There should not be what we can say authorized access for the development. Then drainage before planning. Always try to understand whenever we are constructing the infrastructure, after construction, after understanding, after enjoying the flooded situation over there during the very next rainy season, we start planning for the drainage aligned related to the infrastructural facilities we have, yes, just developed. And so the drainage should be taken into account as a very prime focus. Next, climate responsive design. When we are talking about the climate responsive design, here we need to study the climate well in advance. We need to respect the human intervention in the sense of understanding the climate response. Now try to understand, we the human being are only dealing with the what we can say the natural resources, and that is the reason they are get depleted, they are get disturbed, their cycles has been disturbed, and that is the reason the climate is responding differently. We nowadays enjoying the rain, or what we can say the monsoon sort of season throughout the year, and this is just because of the human intervention. So that we need to understand, and this is already mentioned way before in 2005. Retrofitting critical infrastructure. Now try to understand, as per the HIGO framework, they are mentioning that the retrofitting should be the very easily what we can say implemented or controlled. Retrofitting, if it is the critical what we can say critically handled, if it is a complex phenomena, then definitely after what we can say disaster recovery is very difficult, and that is what the HIGO is emphasizing. Next one, when we are talking about the next parameter, that is its principle for the rural planning. Here in rural planning, the vulnerability or what we can say the concerns are different. The water scarcity is the very first concern in the rural area. During disaster, many a times there will be the great impact on the communities due to the unavailability of the potable water or the domestic purpose water supply in that particular area. So the water scarcity is nothing but one of the concern. Climate dependent livelihood, yes, they are totally dependent on the climate. Whatever they are, what we can say planning for their bread and butter, they are totally dependent on the climate. Limited infrastructure facilities are there. Once any road connecting to rural areas, they are get disturbed due to the disaster, then definitely there will be a great havoc, and that is the reason the rural vulnerabilities are different from the urban one. So HIGO suggested some solution, that is safe site selection, climate resilient housing, protected access routes, and the ecosystem based planning should be there, and that is what we need to understand as a whole. So when we are talking about who builds the resilient settlements, so there are so many what we can say the interdisciplinary fraternities required for building the resilient settlement. This is not only a cup of tea of civil engineer or geotechnical engineer or architect, but everyone needs to work together in association with the same vision and mission, then only the resilient settlement will happen. Now try to understand, for civil engineering, basically role is related to the resilient infrastructure. When we are talking about the geotechnical engineers, the role is related with the site and the slope safety. When talking about the architect, it is the climate adaptive built form. When we are talking about the planners or the policymakers, it is a risk informed layout. When we are talking about the administration, it is the governance and the enforcement. So everyone needs to work collectively. So resilience is a collective professional responsibility. It is not anyone single's responsibility. Now, at the end, what we learned through the HIGO framework for the disaster resilient infrastructure. So, disaster risk is shaped by the planning decision. So, the planning is very important. So, risk related to the disaster is basically what we can say dampened by the planning. So if there is a good planning, definitely the disaster risk is get lower down. Secondly, the climate change must be mainstream. Till date, we are not at all concerning about the climate change and its impact or the futuristic impact on the planned infrastructure, and that is what we need to understand. Prevention is cheaper than the recovery, so it is better to invest into the resilient infrastructure than the disaster recovery. Resilient settlement requires the strong governance. So for that, during planning phase, definitely there should be the wholehearted involvement from all the government authorities and the planners or the policymakers in that particular concern. Engineering ethics now include the disaster risk reduction. Till date, we are only worried about the structural parameter, the volume of the steel, the size and shape of the bars, the concrete and its mixed proportion, the aggregate and its what we can say the quality. But now here onwards, alongside with this particular conventional materials, there should be the additional parameter needs to be considered, and that is nothing but the disaster risk reduction. So the resilient urban and rural settlements are planned deliberately, not rebuilt repeatedly. That's what we learned through the HIGO framework. Now, next one, why planning matters in disaster and climate risk reduction. Now, after HIGO, everyone may be aware about the Sendai framework. So there is another framework called as Sendai. So here in this particular framework, try to understand what they have mentioned. So we will learn quickly about the Sendai framework and go ahead. So are not only the hazard driven, but it is planning driven. So try to understand it is our responsibility, and we when we seems to be responsible, we need to think very what we can say closely related to this accountability. So now the climate change amplifies the existing vulnerability. Urban and rural settlement concentrate the people, assets, and the risk, and planning decision lock the risk for the decades. So while looking toward this particular 4 points, the fourth one, planning decisions lock the risk for the decades. So try to understand the risk reduction, or we can say the removal or the completely diminishing the risk is in hands of the planner. So here, whenever we are talking about the planning, here our responsibility is raised at a new bar. So the every layout plan, zoning decision, and the site selection is nothing but the disaster risk decision. So there is a great scope for the civil engineer to map the area for various disaster, for the compound disaster rather. Then accordingly, we can able to give them the site selection for that particular infrastructural activities, and then definitely there will be a disaster risk reduction, and this is nothing but the good or the wise decision in this particular regard. Now see the Sendai framework, a planning and engineering perspective we would like to learn through this particular framework. Now this particular framework is showing the shift from disaster management to the disaster risk management. Now try to understand the importance of the word risk associated with the next parameter. Earlier, what we were doing, we were not ready to, yes, what we can say, ready for any disaster. We are not in position to get recovered out of that disaster. But now, with the advanced technology, with the global aspect, with the various, what we can say, the SDGs, we need to first of all calculate the risk calculation is definitely a possible, or we can say the control parameter at our end, so we can able to calculate the risk, and then we can manage the risk. And therefore here, through Sendai framework, we got some insight, the new insight or additional insight apart from the Hyogo's framework. So here Sendai framework is emphasizing on prevention or preventing the new risk. What does it mean? As from the history, we learn various, from the failure, we learn so many things. So we are in position to understand the typical risk associated with the any infrastructure. And now, once we are aware about that particular risk, then there should not be, yes, what we can say, the risk newly, what we can say, introduced after any disaster that particular infrastructure has beared. So there should not be any missing risk. That is what the meaning of the preventing new risk. So we need to 360 degree in 360 what we can say 360-degree aspect. We need to understand the risk associated with the infrastructure, and accordingly we have to reduce it. Next one, reducing the existing risk. As we have learned from the failure cases from the past, now there should not be, yes, the risk which will impact very greatly on the communities, and so the reduction is in our hand. Strengthening the resilience, so there should be the proper selection of the material, methods and machineries while going for the infrastructural development. It applies to the both natural and human induced hazard, and the strong emphasis on land use, infrastructure governance and investment. So here, try to understand, when we are talking about the land use, there should be the zonation map available. When we are talking about the infrastructure, there should be the innovative infrastructure should be planned for the next generation. There will be a good governance we are expecting, and investment, the very important parameter. Investment for the resilient is allowed, but not for the recovery. If with this particular theme we go ahead, definitely infrastructure will long last for many decades. So prevent new and reduce the existing disaster risk. This is the very important parameter we learned from the Sendai framework. Now understanding the disaster risk in settlements. Now try to understand what are the different yes settlements. Yes, there is a urban settlement, there is a rural settlement, and what are the risk component associated with it. Now hazards, I have already told you the different types of hazards. Exposure for the communities, for the buildings or the infrastructure. Vulnerability, when there will be a great vulnerability, when there is a poor design, when there is a weak materials uptake, when there is an informal growth. Capacity, it is related to the governance, preparedness and services. It is totally in hand of what we can say the authorities, those who are dealing with the disaster. So here the Sendai framework is emphasizing on, don't calculate or don't try to what we can say treat equally the risk and the hazard. Okay, so risk is not at all equals to the hazard alone. The hazard will never ever define the risk associated with it, but it is defined by the exposure, it is defined by the vulnerability, and it is defined by the capacity we do have. And that is the reason risk is not at all equals to hazard alone. Secondly, the poor planning multiplies the hazard impact. So though risk is equals to exposure multiplied by vulnerability multiplied by capacity multiplied by hazard, but it is the planning which will multiply it by, say suppose 10x, when we are about to deal with the disaster. So here the poor planning is again the important parameter. Apart from this particular four parameter, this is what is suggested through the Sendai framework. Now, while talking about the climate change and the settlement vulnerability, there is an increased frequency of the extremes, that is nothing but the intense rainfall, heat waves and drought. Why this is happening? This is the nothing but the matter of concern. And this particular study needs to be done at a greater extent. Now try to understand, the Mumbai is ready for handling 24 or 42 millimeter of the rainfall. Okay, and if 942 millimeter of the rainfall is happening in a single day, then what will happen to the stormwater drainage system design for the Mumbai? So this sort of studies needs to be done prior, before designing any other infrastructural activity. Infrastructural design for the historical climate is failing because generally we are going for the average, and we need to go for now extreme ends. Climate projection must be informed planning. So climate projection needs to be considered while going for the planning. So here we can link the Sendai framework with the infrastructural activity like this. The climate change is recognized as a driver of the disaster risk. So try to understand, we need to keep the close eye on the climate change. Now next one, land use planning as the first line of defense. Yes, being a what we can say the concerned authority for the risk reduction with any infrastructural development, the very first line of defense as per the Sendai framework is nothing but the land use planning. So avoid development in floodplains, coastal lowlands and unstable slope. Preserve the natural drainage. They have emphasized very importantly on natural drainage. That is what I have shared earlier, that though the stream order of any river remains same, but it is the stream numbers with the different orders, they are get reduced. So the natural drainage needs to be preserved very, what we can say, greatly. Wetlands should be there to deal with the floods. Buffer zones should be there so that there will be the less impact on the, what we can say, infrastructural activities. So for engineers and planner, we can just say from the Sendai framework that safe land use reduces the risk more effectively than the structural solution alone. So don't think much about the improvement in the steel, improvement in the mixed design of the concrete or any allied material. It is nothing but the actual land use where we are about to build the infrastructure in future. Now, next one, governance and the institutional role in resilient settlement. Now, try to understand. There should be the very crystal clear understanding of the various roles by various entities. So the planning authority, engineering departments, and disaster management agency, they must have their own vision, why and how they are about to reduce the risk. Enforcement of development control rules, building codes should be there. Whenever we are following any design, there should be the clearly mentioning about the IS codal provisions or the code, what we can say, the clauses. Accountability for the risk creation, this should be, yes, shared with every, what we can say, the civil engineer, architect, or any engineering fraternity, that the person will be, is proved accountable when there will be a risk. Okay, so risk related to the planning for that particular personnel should be considered once the disaster and its impact, once the risk has been calculated wrongly, once there will be a great impact on the lives and the properties. So the accountability should be there. If person is considered to be accountable, definitely he will be looking into the planning phase very carefully. So the Sendai emphasizes on strong disaster risk governance across the sector. Now, next one, the investing in the resilient urban and rural infrastructure. Am I audible? So infrastructure must be climate responsive, hazard resistant, and life cycle cost efficient. Now here we are focusing mainly on, yes, the climate responsive. We are taking care of the hazard. We are taking care of the life cycle cost, as we are having the very limited resources. But here the main focus should be on the roads, drainages, and the water supply, because they are the main communication lines. There should be the less impact on the schools, hospital, and housing, so we could give the better life for the coming generation. So this is nothing but the main concern when we are talking about the resilient investment in the resilient urban and rural infrastructure. This should be prioritized. So the risk informed investment is the cost effective, and that is what we learn from this particular parameter. Now see the multidisciplinary role of engineers. We have already discussed that civil engineers should deal with the infrastructure resilience and so on and so forth. So here the resilience is a team outcome, not a single discipline task. So whenever we are preparing the DPR, this should be prepared by a team, not by one single, what we can say, the structural engineer or the civil engineer as a single entity. And that is what we need to understand. Next one, the preparedness and the build back better in settlement. This is what suggested through the Sendai framework, that preparedness must be planned before disaster. Post disaster reconstruction is an opportunity. So once there is an opportunity, we all are aware that the opportunity knocks only once. We have to encash it. So whenever there is an opportunity, we have to go for the safer locations. We have to go for the improved standard. We have to go for the reduced future risk. And this is what the build back and better. So here we can say that the preparedness and the recovery as a resilience tool. So the preparedness is as good as important as recovery. So this is the important parameter related to the post disaster and its impact on the infrastructure. Next one, urban versus rural settlement, how the Sendai framework and through the specs of the Sendai principles, we can able to discriminate the urban and rural settlements. Now see, under the urban, they are focusing much on density management, drainage and heat stress, and the informal settlement. While for rural, they are focusing on, similarly with the HIGO, the water security, access road and services, and climate resilient livelihood. So the core idea is nothing but the resilience principles are universal, solutions are context specific. Though there is a urban, though there is a rural, though there is a discrimination, but it is nothing but the context specific. So we have to apply the localized solution while going for the infrastructural development. Now, in line with the Sendai framework, we have to correlate the sustainable development goals. Why? Because now we have learned the HIGO 2005 to 2015, Sendai from 2015 to 2013, and now we have to correlate the same with the SDGs that we are living nowadays. We all are aware that there are sustainable development goals, which is nothing but the global level, what we can say, goals defined by the various countries, and they all together living that particular common goals for the better society for the next generation. So there are few SDGs, they are linked with the infrastructural development. The first one is the SDG 11, which is nothing but sustainable cities and communities. SDG 9, resilient infrastructure. 13, climate action. And SDG 1, the poverty reduction. Now see, the disaster risk reduction is essential for sustainable development. So whenever we are reducing the risk of the disaster, they are helping for the sustainable development. This is a very, what we can say, the crystal clear approach we need to follow. So disasters are largely planning induced. So whenever we are talking about the disaster and risk associated, always keep in mind, if we are not planned the infrastructure properly, then disaster and its risk is about to be get improved. Climate change demands new decision design thinking. So for the highest level of what we can say the severity, we have to plan the infrastructure. Risk informed planning saves the lives and money, and Sendai framework provides a clear action roadmap, so that we need to follow. So resilient settlements are not built after disaster, they are planned before the first brick has laid. This is what we have learned through the Sendai framework. Now we will move ahead. Why the sustainable development goals matter for the resilient settlement. So disaster, climate change, and development are interlinked, that we have learned. Unsafe settlement reverse the decades of development gain. This we need to understood through the various global level failures. Now, if unsafe settlements are there, definitely there will be the what we can say the hurdle in between the vision that we are living nowadays, that is Viksit Bharat by 2047. So definitely one unsafe settlement, one disaster, and its impact on that settlement will just supposed to stop our progress towards the development. Now, SDGs provide a global planning and development roadmap. Resilience is embedded across the multiple SDGs, not just one, that we have learned. And now, for that, we will move ahead with the SDGs as an integrated planning framework. Now, see the 193 countries, okay, across the globe, they have just opted these SDGs and they are start working on it. So they are addressing the poverty, infrastructure, climate, ecosystem, and governance. Generally, the emphasis has been given on the long-term, inclusive, and the risk-informed development. Now, see, when we are talking about its applicability for the urban and rural settlement, we will discuss this in detail in coming slide. So, it is the global vision into the local planning responsibility. So, disaster and the climate risk in the SDGs. So, these are particular, yes, what we can say the concern. Disaster push people back into poverty. So, SDG 1, disaster is having direct connection with SDG 1. Unsafe water and sanitation worsen the post-disaster impact. This is SDG 6. So disaster, see how everything has been interconnected. Infrastructure failure disrupt the livelihood and services. So it is SDG 9. And the climate change amplifies the settlement vulnerability. It is SDG 13. So disaster risk is a cross-cutting barrier to all the SDGs, and that's why we need to work on the this particular yes disaster risk reduction at a great sense. Now, SDG 11. So, try to understand making settlement inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. Here, what we are expecting the safe and affordable housing. We we are expecting risk sensitive land use planning, slump upgrading, and informal settlement improvement, disaster resilient urban infrastructure. So in nutshell, we can say that resilient settlement planning is related with the SDG 11. Okay, now when we are talking about the SDG 9, it is talking about the infrastructure as the backbone of the resilience. Now see, the infrastructure must be hazard resilient, climate responsive, and the service continuity focused. So this particular three parameter, if we could give the justice to this parameter and if we could mention this in DPR, definitely the project will get sanctioned. So the roads, drainage, bridges, utilities are lifelines that we need to understand, and accordingly we have to plan the same. Failure cascades across settlement, that we have to prove, and we have to stop such a sort of settlement. So the resilient infrastructure reduces disaster losses and recovery time. So this particular parameter we have to emphasize while preparing the DPR. Now the SDGs 13, the climate change intensifies the floods, heat waves and droughts. Planning must be using the climate projection and adaptation strategies. Design for the extremes, not for the historical averages, that what we have discussed so far. So SDG 13 is just asking us for design for the extreme severity, not for the historical averages. So the climate responsive planning is required. When we are talking about the next point, that is the water sensitive settlement planning. So the flooding and the water scarcity often coexist, and that is what we need to understand. So natural drainage, wetland and recharge zone should be preserved, and that is what the importance of the giving the permission for the infrastructural development. So infrastructure should not be suggested in such a areas where the natural drainage will get hampered, wetlands will be get reduced, recharge zone will be get hampered. So the water security is the disaster resilience, and that is what we need to understand through SDG 6. Now SDG 15, ecosystem reduce the disaster risk, like forest stabilizes slope, wetland buffers the flood. This needs to be kept into mind, and accordingly there should be a restriction for the development. So the nature based solution complements engineered system, that we need to understand. If you are just reducing the forest, if you are reducing the wetland area, its diverse effect will be there on us. So environmental degradation increases the hazard impact. Planning must conserve the natural buffers, that we need to understand. Next one, reducing vulnerability through the inclusive planning. The poor and marginalized communities face highest disaster risk. So this particular parameter needs to be addressed very well. Informal settlement often located in hazard prone areas. So there will be a great exposure, there will be an inequality in terms of the, yes, awareness, disaster losses will be great. So resilience without inclusion is incomplete resilience. So there should be the inclusion of every community, or what we can say, everyone from the society for the proper planning. Institution and governance for resilient settlement. Now see, here we are in need of the strong institution. Enforcement of regulation should be there, transparency and accountability should be there. So here the poor governance create the disaster risk, that we need to understand. So there should not be easily signing of any approvals before understanding its, what we can say, inclusion related to the disaster and risk reduction. So the engineering and governance should be linked together. The codes and plans are effective only when they are enforced, they are in place. So this is nothing but the concerns related to the urban and rural settlement. In urban, we have to focus on density, flood and heat, and infrastructure retrofitting. And at rural, we are again focusing according to the SDG for climate resilient, water security, and access and connectivity. So core principle remains same for HIGO, Sendai, and SDGs, but with the different settlement solution. So try to understand this. So again, at the end, if you are talking about the SDG, it is nothing but the resilient settlement required collaborative engineering practice. So always try to understand there should be the one opinion related to the disaster risk. There should not be different opinion. There should not be different understanding about the disaster and its associated risk from any stakeholder involved in the infrastructural planning. Now, next, as a takeaways, we can say the disaster risk reduction is essential for SDG achievement. Planning decisions shape the long-term risk. Climate change must be mainstreamed, and infrastructure, ecosystem, and the governance are interconnected. So the planning resilient urban and rural settlement is not just a good engineering, it is a global development responsibility, as SDGs are associated now with the disaster and its risk reduction. Now, the next, what we can say, the framework is Paris Agreement and Resilient Settlement. I know I have only 15 minutes and I have so many slides. Uh, I could able to reach to the 50% of the slides I have prepared for this session. But yes, by keeping into mind the time constraint and the vast, what we can say, the area related to the infrastructure resilient infrastructure and its development, and there are so many sessions in pipeline, so we will cover in detail up to the slides where we could able to reach in coming next 15 minutes. So see, the Paris Agreement and the resilient settlement. So what is the importance of Paris Agreement? What is the impact on the overall global level construction activities associated with the Paris Agreement that we need to understand? So the climate change is a systematic risk to the settlement. Urban and rural areas are on the front line of the climate impacts, and Paris Agreement in this particular sense links with the first, the climate action, second, sustainable development, and the third one is the poverty reduction. So Paris Agreement, as a India is a part of this particular agreement, we have to work closely in this particular regard. So the climate resilient settlements are essential to achieve the Paris goals that we need to understand. So the resilient settlement planning is a central to climate response. See, there are few articles as per the Paris Agreement. The article number 2 is mentioning about the global temperature and its limits. So, limit the global temperature rise to well below 2 degree 2, or we can say need to pursue up to 1.5 degrees Celsius. That is what the objective number 2. Now, see, if we follow these particular agreements, if we keep into mind while planning the infrastructure accordingly, definitely there will be a help in the disaster and its risk reduction. Again, increase the adaptive capacity and climate resilience. So adaptive capacity of infrastructure needs to be considered. Align development with the low emission climate resilient pathway. Low emissions means what? They are correlating with the carbon footprint. So carbon credit needs to be considered while developing any infrastructural project, and that is what the article 2 is suggesting to us. So the settlement planning directly influences emissions, exposure, and vulnerability. Emissions in terms of the, what we can say, the carbon credits. Exposure is nothing but to the various communities and vulnerabilities. Next one, climate change as a settlement risk multiplier. Now see, the intensified hazards. Intensified means what? Suddenly they will impact at a great extent. So flood, heat waves, drought, cyclone, they are intensified hazard. Climate impacts are location specific, as we all are in position to study the localized area. So the climate impact, as it is the location specific, we supposed to plan, we supposed to suggest such a resilient infrastructural solution to that particular area. That is the need according to the Paris Agreement. The poor planning amplifies the climate damage. Now see, they have also mentioned the vulnerability which depends on land use, infrastructural quality, and socio-economic condition. Now, yes, vulnerability means what? If I am not in a good socio-economical condition, I am not able to afford the quality materials, quality methodology, and quality, what we can say, workmanship over there. And that is what the vulnerability depends on. So we need to deal with this. So whenever we are going for the infrastructural development, we have to think, okay, the number of infrastructural projects to be handled simultaneously. Against that, what will be the solution or midway that step by step we could able to reach and achieve the target set. So the climate disaster are shaped more by planning choices than by the climate alone. Next one, the article 7, it focuses on strengthening the adaptive capacity, reducing the vulnerability, and protecting the people, livelihoods, and ecosystem. Now try to understand, this agreement helps us in terms of the planning. So they emphasizes on climate responsive and land use planning, risk sensitive infrastructure layout, and the ecosystem based adoption in settlement. So these particular 3 points needs to be considered while developing any infrastructural design. Next one, land use planning for climate resilience. Now what they are suggesting through this particular agreement is that avoid the development in floodplains, coastal lowlands and the heat stress zones. They are also emphasizing on preserve the natural drainage and the green and the blue infrastructure, and plan the compact but ventilated settlement. And that is what we are in need of. So the Paris Agreement again given us the two additional point against the earlier discussion: green and blue infrastructure and plan compact but ventilated settlement. That we need to understand. So the safest structure is one not built in a high risk location but at very low risk yes locations. Now see, the Paris this particular agreement and its alignment is related to the infrastructure in supports to its adoption, in supports to low carbon development. So any infrastructural development activity should be associated with the carbon credit related report. So thorough study related to the carbon development should be there in DPR. So the roads, drainage, water, energy as a lifeline, when we are concerned what we can say developing during this particular yes development, there should be this particular study needs to be done. So the design for climate extremes, not for average, redundancy and flexibility, and the life cycle performance under climate stress, these are nothing but the key features consider. Next one, climate resilient urban planning. So urban challenges, yes, there are urban challenges identified by the Paris Agreement: heat islands, urban flooding, high emission concentration, and they have also suggested some solutions to the same. So the climate sensitive zoning should be done. Green roofs and open spaces should be considered while suggesting any infrastructural development. Public transport oriented planning. Nowadays, though there is a BRTS system, though there is a metro, mono, or any other solution for the public transports, but still we don't have that particular what we can say flexibility, and we don't have that much inclination toward the public transport system and its uses because of its improper governance. So the public transport oriented planning is one of the solution for the disaster and its risk reduction, and the flood resilient drainage system. So here from the Paris Agreement, we can say that the green roofs and open spaces and public transport oriented planning is much important. Next one, for rural area, yes, the problems remain same, risk remains same: droughts, water scarcity, and the climate dependent livelihood, but the solutions are somewhat different. So the water secure layout should be prepared for the rural area. Ecosystem based planning should be done, and the access infrastructure for emergency should be there. So this is what they are expecting through such a agreement from the yes government of India. Now minimizing loss and damage through the planning. So article number 8 is emphasizing on this particular parameter: averting and minimizing the loss and damage. Early warning system should be there at place, and the emergency preparedness should be there. So here the planning role is very much important. So the safe evacuation routes, the protected lifelines, and the risk aware settlement expansion, if it is there in place as a part and parcel of the governance, definitely there will be a less what we can say of the loss to the property. Next one, enablers of the climate resilience settlement. Through Paris agreement, they are emphasizing through three different article: article 9 climate finance, article 10 technology transfer, and article 11 capacity building. So here what they are expecting from the engineers like us is climate resilient design standards. So we could able to add some amendments to the existing code. Adoption of the new material and technology, this is nothing but the part and parcel of the invention. And the skilled professional and institution where the resources are lagging, so this is the gray area for us to give the solution by referring to all these particular frameworks we have discussed so far. So see, the role of engineers, again it is nothing but the Paris Agreement succeed on the ground through the engineering decisions. So it is also here also mentioned that it is a team game, not a single personal's responsibility. So Paris Agreement emphasizing on the planning and the resilient settlement. So here we need to understand that climate resilience, adaptation, then the proper land use, and the settlements, they needs to be considered as per the yes agreement the government of India has done so far. Now next one, the understanding of the disaster resilience beyond the resistance. This is what we have learned so far, and now we have to convert it into the yes, actual what we can say the practical sense. So disaster resilience is beyond the resistance. So there should not be the action and reaction. There should be the adaptability. There should be the absorption. There should be the reduction. So resilience is not just the strength, it is adaptive capacity. So the capacity of the systems to anticipate risk, reduce the vulnerability, adapt to change, and recover and transform. This is what any infrastructure system must have. It applies to various communities, infrastructure, institution, and the governance system. So see, according to the Patron and Johnston, resilience is not about avoiding all damage. It is about how well a system prepares, adapts, and learns. So this is what we need to learn while designing the infrastructure. Now see, a bridge failing is the example of engineering failure, but a community unable to recover is the example of resilience failure. So try to understand the crystal clear is what we can say the gap in between these particular two terminology. What is engineering failure and what is resilience failure? So resilience is a dynamic process, not a fixed design. So every time resilience should be the localized or what we can say thoroughly planned with the local conditions. Now see, from structural safety to the system resilience. Okay, last 5 minutes. Structural safety to the system resilience. Engineering safety versus resilience thinking, we can able to bifurcate it with the some different points. So in engineering we are focusing much on strength based design. We are planning for the design load, asset focus, and failure avoided. In resilience we are more focused on capacity based, where the uncertainty and extremes levels of the parameters has been considered. It is totally a system focus because all the stakeholders, all the various what we can say the entities while dealing with the disaster supposed to be as considered while designing the resilience. And the failure anticipated, yes, we are accepting, we are anticipating the failures, but at the same time we are prepared, we are ready to dampen the risk associated with the projects. So here resilient infrastructure works before the, during, and after the disaster, not only before the disaster. That we need to understand. Now see the core components of disaster resilience. So here we need to consider the risk knowledge. So there should be one particular study in proper format for the risk is calculation and about the risk knowledge. There should be the planning and preparedness before and after disaster. Adaptive capacity should be there. If there is any what we can say great impact to the infrastructure, existing infrastructure, what will be the, yes, the plan B. Social and institutional support and learning feedback. So see the risk knowledge that we could able to touch with the hazard maps preparation. Preparedness, where we could able to regularize the land use zoning. Adaptive capacity, here we are very much open for the innovative methodology. Flexible design should be there. Institution, there should be the enforcement and governance. And for learning, the post disaster audit should be properly is executed. So the resilience emerges from the connection, not from the components. Next one, why infrastructure alone cannot deliver the resilience. Now try to understand. We will try to discuss this with the example. Safe building plus unsafe location, this is causing the failure. Strong road but with blocked evacuation, it is also causing the failure. So here we can say a perfectly designed building on landslide prone slope is still a bad decision. Okay, so encroachment, informal settlement, and enforcement gap, this needs to be considered, this needs to be identified and discussed in DPR as well. So in DPR, detailed project report, we need to discuss about the encroachment when we are talking about the disaster risk, regarding informal settlement in that area and enforcement gap. If we are only thinking that we are there to take care of only the infrastructural activities or infrastructural design, we don't have any correlation with any other what we can say associated points, then definitely there will be a disaster. So the resilient settlement are socio-technical system. Here we need to consider the at 360-degree all the parameter associated with the yes infrastructural execution. Multi-scale nature of resilience. See, resilience must exist at multiple levels simultaneously. So individual and household, community and neighborhood, settlement, cities, villages, regional and ecosystem. at a glance, everyone who could able to enjoy the resilience at their own level. So failures scale cascade into another. If individual is suffering from disaster, means what? Household is suffering, or community is suffering. If any city is suffering, means what? Nearby the district and tehsil and everything is disturbed. So this is what need to understand multi-scale nature of resilience. Then next one, resilience as the foundation of sustainable development goals, that we have already discussed. So we will move ahead. Applying the resilience theory to the settlement planning. So turn the capacity into the planning decision. First one, risk informed land use. Just aware the people that at land pockets where you are developing the project, what will be the risk? Climate responsive design should be there, redundancy in lifelines should be there, flexible infrastructure system should be there, and maintenance and monitoring should be observed. So we can say that resilience is not the added after the design, it is the embedded during the planning. Now see the professional responsibility in building resilience. So everyone is having their own responsibility towards this particular study. So resilience is a professional obligation, not optional innovation. Engineer shapes exposure, planner shapes vulnerability, designer shapes adaptability, and institution shapes outcome. So if we could able to focus on this particular parameter, definitely every drawing you sign, every DPR you approve, every site you ignore, either builds resilience or creates the future disaster. That we need to understand in nutshell. So resilience is not about predicting disaster, it is about preparing system to live with the uncertainty. Okay, so uh, yes, to organizing team, can I extend the session or I need to stop over here, because the part A of this session has been, yes, done so far.
Sir, we can extend the session for more 10 minutes.
Okay, thank you so much. So we will discuss one case study, and then we will move to the conclusion, because I have more than 7 case studies I have prepared for this particular study. So see the resilience in the face of the ecological challenges, the strategies for integrating environmental consideration into social policy planning in Africa. Now, this is the research article from the 2025. The recent research article is there, and these particular parameters, as we have discussed so many framework, how we could able to apply to this, that we need to, yes, see. Now, so see, so far in this session, we have discussed the resilience as a concept, its linkages with the sustainable development, and the critical role of planning and engineering in shaping the outcomes. Now, let me take you to a very important international case study, not from the developed country, but from Africa. I'm intentionally referring to Africa because the challenges discussed in this case study are similar to what we experience in India as well. So, this case study is based on 2025 research work. The central message of this study, we can say that, is simple yet extremely powerful. Ecological resilience must be embedded into planning system. It cannot be treated as an environmental add-on or post-approval formality. So see, till this particular point, we have not considered the ecology, but this particular research article emphasizing the need on the ecological study as well. So this study examines the regions that face the climate extreme, increasing water stress, fragile ecosystem, rapid urban rural transition. When we look at this condition closely, we realize that they perfectly mirror the Indian context. Now see, in the Indian African regions, okay, this particular study is related to the flood, droughts, landslide, settlement, failure were frequently observed. However, the research clearly established that these were not purely natural disaster. They were largely the result of how the settlements were planned, where the infrastructure was located, and how ecological systems were ignored during the development. So here also, through this research article that I have studied earlier, they have clearly mentioned that it is not only related to the only disaster, it is related to the, yes, not only related to the hazard, it is related to the exposure, it is related to the vulnerability, it is related to the, yes, the planning in nutshell. So one of the most important technical insight from this particular parameter is nothing but infrastructure does not fail first, ecosystem fail first. So this is what we need to understand. When the natural drainage paths are blocked, flooding becomes inevitable. When slopes are cut without understanding the soil behavior and stability, landslides are about to occur. When vegetation is removed, erosion accelerates and water system collapse. Once these ecological systems are disturbed or destroyed, infrastructural failure becomes only a matter of time. So this clearly shows that the disaster impacts are not accidental; they are engineered through the planning and design decision. So clearly they have correlated the study that whatever we have planned, whatever the decisions we have took at the time of planning, they are nothing but the main concern of the failure in this particular ecological system. This study further highlights that environmental systems should not be seen as a constraint on the development. Instead, they function as infrastructure enablers. Natural drainage networks, slopes, soils, vegetation, and watersheds play a fundamental role in protecting settlement. When these systems are ignored, disaster losses increases, infrastructure life cycle cost rise sharply, and recovery capacity weakens significantly. So resilient settlement therefore are those that align natural system, built infrastructure and institutional decision making in a coordinated manner. So here they have again emphasized on, yes, we are the main culprit in this particular scenario. So in conclusion, we can say that this case study teaches us one universal and unavoidable lesson, that engineering excellence without ecological intelligence produces fragile infrastructure. So resilient settlements are not built by the stronger concrete alone. They are built while engineering and planning decision respect ecological realities and integrate environmental system into the core of development thinking. So with this understanding, we can now move the forward, the examine the Indian case study. So see the case study one, they are emphasizing on how we have failed during the, yes, what we can say the planning stage. Now case study two, these are from the foreign case study. We will see one Indian case study as well. So we will discuss the case study number 6. Now see the building disaster resilience in India, tackling the vulnerabilities through risk reduction and management. Now see, try to just go through these particular bullet points I have mentioned over here. I will explain. Now this study begins by mapping the disaster risk landscape of India. India is exposed to multiple and overlapping hazards according to this study, including the flood, cyclone, droughts, earthquake, landslide, heat waves, and increasingly the frequent urban flooding. These hazards occur across the diverse geographical regions, affecting both urban and rural settlement. Rapid urbanization, large-scale infrastructure expansion, climate change have significantly increased exposure, while planning system and enforcement mechanism have struggled to keep the pace with this growth. Now they have emphasized on how the planning system and enforcement mechanism is struggled. That is what we have discussed so far. So this should be the integral part of any DPR. Now see, they have also mentioned that this study identifies the several major drivers of vulnerability in the Indian context. Unplanned urban growth has led to the dense settlement in floodplain. So unplanned urban growth. So we have to restrict such a sort of growth. At the same time, when we are talking about this particular parameter, see, floodplains, coastal zones, and unstable hill slope. These are the areas where this particular settlement has been done. Secondly, informal housing and unauthorized construction often lack basic safety provision and are highly exposed to hazard. As when there is a no authority is allowed to give you some particular approvals, then the methods, materials, and the money you are about to invest will be at the lower end, and that is the why such a sort of informal construction that leads to the vulnerable assets. Aging and poorly maintained infrastructure such as drainage system, road, bridges, and water supply network further amplifies the disaster impact. In addition, limited integration of the risk information into development planning and the weak coordination among the institution compound this vulnerability. Now see, at the same time, they are emphasizing on excessive reliance on post-disaster relief and recovery does little to reduce the future losses. So here what they are suggested through the approved plan that we are ready to deal with any disaster in future, but it is nothing but the foolish thinking if you are not planning at the very early stage to reduce the risk associated with the disaster, and we are saying that we are ready to cope up with the yes recovery and the we are prepared for dealing with the disaster, then this is nothing but the very what we can say the poor thing in terms of the planning. So this study also highlights the critical role of preparedness and early warning system in reducing the disaster impacts. Investment in early warning technologies, reliable communication system, and emergency access infrastructure significantly improve the response effectiveness. So they are emphasizing that there should be the investment into the resilience, not into the disaster recovery. So in conclusion, this case study reinforces a fundamental principle of disaster resilience in India. Reducing the disaster risk is not a separate activity carried out during the emergency, but continuous process embedded in everyday planning, engineering, and governance decision. When risk reduction is integrated into development pathways, India can significantly reduce the disaster losses while supporting the sustainable and inclusive growth. So this is all about few case studies that I need to discuss with you. I will share the presentation as well afterwards. So there is a Disaster Management Act 2005 in which the section 41C is there, which is related with the legal framework requires the risk reduction to be mainstreamed into all planning and development. So disaster resilience is a legal obligation already, but we all are not aware about this section 41C from NDMA, and that's why whatever the DPR we are preparing, they are not up to the mark according to the government rules and regulation. So NDMA technical guidelines are also there. They have given the technical guidelines. So this NDMA technical guidelines will serve as a what we can say additional codes alongside with the IS code that we are using for the structural design. So technical backbone for resilient design is already there. We need to follow. So risk identification and integration in development, NDMA guideline on seismic retrofitting, urban flood management, then landslide risk management, heat cold and multi-hazard design, then engineering for preparedness, okay, sensor network and structural health monitoring, real-time data integration, public alerting and evacuation route planning. So these are there. So we need to upgrade existing infrastructure. So retrofitting related codal provisions are also there. There are some SOP from the NDMA. So bridging engineering planning and governance. So it is a multidisciplinary approach we need to yes consider. So see, this is related to some yes IS codal provisions. These particular codal provisions and recent amendments, they are required to be studied thoroughly before preparing any yes what we can say the DPR. So there are 5 M's as I have already told you: main, material, machinery, there, then methods, money, and above that the time. So these are nothing but the total what we can say the study we need to consider. So at conclusion for practitioner, we can conclude like the legal framework mandates the integration of DRR, disaster risk reduction, into settlement planning. NDMA guidelines provide the specific engineering direction that we need to follow alongside with the codal provisions. Disaster resilience requires both asset strength and system coordination, and the planning must be risk informed, climate adaptive, and enforceable. There is one beautiful video is also there, but due to the time concern I'm unable to play. So thank you so much, and thank you so much for patientful listening to me. I know this is the theoretical part, but we need to understand thoroughly the various framework. That's why I explained it thoroughly. So over to the organizing committee. Thank you so much once again.
Thank you so much, sir, for this enlightening and insightful session, sir. So, before we move to the concluding part, I would like to request the participants to ask the questions if there are any and share their feedbacks as well. They have the liberty to unmute themselves if required. The participants are requested to put the questions in this forum now. Chat box is flooded with wonderful feedbacks. So,
Thank you so much.
yes, are there any questions from the participants? Okay. So, on behalf of the organizing committee of the AICT Atal Faculty Development Program, I would like to express my sincere gratitude to our esteemed resource person of this session, Dr. Sudarshan Bobde sir, for sharing his valuable knowledge and expertise with us. His session was highly informative and provided a clear and practical insights into planning resilient urban and rural settlements by integrating climate and disaster risk considerations. We truly appreciate the time, effort, and the dedication he has put into making this session meaningful and engaging. I would also like to thank all the participants for attending the session and for their active participation, which has greatly contributed to the success of the session. Your enthusiasm and engagement made the session more interactive and encouraging. Once again, we thank everyone for their valuable presence and support for making this session a success. One more thing, tomorrow we'll be having three sessions as a part of this program. We request all the participants to kindly stay connected and actively participate in all the sessions. The session timings will be from 11 to 12:30 in the afternoon, 2 to 3:30, and from 4:30 to 6. The links will be provided prior. Thank you for your cooperation, and we hope you have a productive learning experience through this FTP. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you all.